So today we will talk about the French Revolution and how it altered the geopolitical landscape of Europe. In this lecture you will learn the causes of the French Revolution. How did the Enlightenment and the American Revolution influence the French Revolution? The reforms of the National Assembly described as the death warrant of the old regime? Why was the French Revolution a decisive period in the shaping of the modern West? So what can you say about the origins of the French Revolution?
Since July 1789, the origins of the French Revolution have been one of the most debated topics in history. Historians long explained the revolution as a clash between the rising bourgeoisie and the entrenched nobility, in which the former asserted its right to political power commensurate with its new economic strength. In uncovering the path to revolution, numerous interrelated factors must be taken into account. These include deep social changes in France, a long-term political crisis that eroded monarchical legitimacy, the impact of new political ideas derived from the Enlightenment, the emergence of a public sphere, in which such opinions were formed and shared, and, perhaps most importantly, a financial crisis created by France's participation in expensive overseas war. More importantly, the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 stirred the imagination of Europeans. Both participants and observers sensed that they were living in a pivotal age. On the ruins of the old order, founded on privilege and despotism, a new era was forming, and it promised to realize the ideals of the Enlightenment.
This was the opening statement of the book depicting the French Revolution by Charles Dickens.
The first part of our discussion will tackle on the background of the French Revolution. First is the revolutionary ideas of the philosophies, and second the War of American Independence.
So tell me about the ideals espoused during the Age of Enlightenment. Why did it influence France?
These ideals included the emancipation of the human personality from superstition and tradition, the triumph of liberty over tyranny, the refashioning of institutions in accordance with reason and justice, and the tearing down of barriers to equality. Basic democratic principles like liberty and equality became the foundation of the French Revolution.
Locke had asserted the dignity of the individual in contending that every person has the right to life, liberty, and property, though he excluded slaves in the Americas from such innate rights. He argued that monarchies were based on a social contract between rulers and the ruled. People had to relinquish some of their liberty in exchange for security.
But, unlike Thomas Hobbes, who famously believed that individuals should surrender their rights to the absolute state of unlimited sovereignty, in exchange for protection from the state of nature, Locke insisted that mankind's liberty and rights stemmed from the laws of nature. He became a leading proponent of educational reform, freedom of the press, religious toleration, and the separation of political powers. The Enlightenment philosophers celebrated reason, while acknowledging the passions, and were suspicious of pure faith. Steeped in respect for science and reason and confident that humanity would discover the truths of nature, they were optimistic about human potential. The philosophers' belief in progress, which Kant insisted was a sign of modernity, separated them sharply from the Catholic Church in particular. States, they thought, were not ordained by God, but by mankind and, like other phenomena, should be subject to critical scrutiny.
Coinciding with the first years of Louis XVI's reign, the American Revolution had an enormous impact on France, both in practical and ideological terms. French expenses to support the colonists bankrupted the crown, while the ideals of liberty and equality provided heady inspiration for political reform. Like the French Revolution, the American Revolution had its immediate origins in struggles over increased taxes. The high cost of the 7 Years' War, fought with little financial contribution from the colonies, doubled the British national debt.
The key questions were political rather than economic. To what extent could the home government assert its power while limiting the authority of colonial legislatures and their elected representatives? Accordingly, who should represent the colonies, and who had the right to make laws for Americans?
The British government replied that Americans were represented in Parliament, albeit indirectly, like most British people themselves, and that the absolute supremacy of Parliament throughout the empire could not be questioned. Many Americans felt otherwise.
How should we look at the French Revolution? A series of revolutions which became more radical as leadership cascaded down through French society. The following were the events of the French Revolution. According to Crane Brinton in his book Anatomy of a Revolution, he borrowed his terms from pathology. Compares a revolution to a fever or a disease. The revolutionary fever begins with the appearance of certain symptoms. It proceeds by advances and retreats to a crisis stage, or delirium. The crisis ends when the fever breaks. A period of convalescence follows, interrupted by a relapse or two before the recovery is complete.
He added further the conditions present before a revolution occurs. 1. People from all social classes are discontented too. They feel restless and held down by unacceptable restrictions in society, religion, the economy or the gov. 3. People are hopeful about the future, but they are being forced to accept less than they had hoped for. 4. People are beginning to think of themselves as belonging to a social class, and there is a growing bitterness between social classes. 5. The social classes closest to one another are the most hostile. 6. The scholars and thinkers give up on the way their society operates. 7. The government does not respond to the needs of its society. 8. The leaders of the government and the ruling class begin to doubt themselves. Some join with the opposition groups. 9. The government is unable to get enough support from any group to save itself. 10. The government cannot organize its finances correctly and is either going bankrupt or trying to tax heavily and unjustly.
The 18th century philosophy taught the Frenchman to find his condition wretched, unjust and illogical, and made him disinclined to the patient resignation to his troubles that had long characterized his ancestors. The propaganda of the philosophes, perhaps more than any other factor, accounted for the fulfillment of the preliminary condition of the French Revolution, namely discontent with the existing state of things.
What are the long-term causes of the French Revolution? The increasing prevalence of the language of the Enlightenment, stressing equality before the law and differentiating between absolute and despotic rule, placed the monarchy and its government under the closer scrutiny of public opinion. Adopting Enlightenment discourse, opponents accused Louis XV of acting despotically when he exiled the Parlement of Paris in 1771 and tried to establish new law courts that were likely to be more subservient than the parliaments the sovereign law courts had been. Opponents believed that the king was trying to subvert long-accepted privileges. Following Louis XV's death in 1774, the young Louis XVI reinstated the parliaments, which retained their right to register royal edicts.
Louis XIV. The consolidation of French monarchical power. The defeat of Protestantism as a national force set the stage for the final consolidation of the French state under the great Bourbon kings, Louis XIII and Louis XIV. Louis XIII, 1610-1643, realized that his rule depended on an efficient and trustworthy bureaucracy, a renewable treasury, and constant vigilance against the localized claims to power by the great aristocracy in Protestant cities and towns. Cardinal Richelieu, who served as the young Louis XV's chief minister from 1624 to 1642, became the great architect of French absolutism. Richelieu's morality rested on one sacred principle, embodied in a phrase he invented: raison d'être, reason of state. He increased the power of the central bureaucracy, attacked the power of independent, and often Protestant, towns and cities, and harassed their Huguenot inhabitants.
The reign of the Bourbon dynasty. France before the Revolution is often referred to as the Ancient Regime. During this period of more than 130 years spanning both the 17th and 18th centuries, the country had just two rulers. The first was King Louis XIV, had a powerful impact on France during his long reign, 1643 to 1715, and is considered by many as the epitome of an absolutist ruler. He centralized power in himself at the expense of the nobility, removing them from positions as governors and ministers and relegating them to the role of courtiers at the royal palace at Versailles. He said that, "I am the state."
Louis implemented policies that led France to emerge as the dominant power in continental Europe. He increased the nation's standing army and fought 4 wars between 1667 and 1713. These wars added to France's international standing and prestige, but left the country deeply in debt. Louis increased this debt by undertaking both public construction, such as new networks of roads and canals, and royal building projects, including the Grand Palace at Versailles. He also spent huge sums maintaining a lavish lifestyle for the royal court at Versailles. He attempted to offset France's mounting deficits by increasing taxes on the peasants, but by the time of his death, the country still remained heavily in debt.
France was the most populous country then. King Louis XV, 1715-1774, proved to be incapable of dealing with France's financial problems and increased the debt by involving France in the 7 Years' War. The war pitted the British and Prussians on one side against the French, Austrians, and Russians on the other. Fighting took place not just in Europe, but also in India and in North America, where the war was known as the French and Indian War, because France allied with Native Americans against the British and American colonists.
Though the war ended up a stalemate in Europe, France suffered defeats to the British in North America and in India. As a result, it was forced to cede some of its colonial possessions. Much of the burden of paying for the war fell on the peasantry.
Following Louis XV's death in 1774, the young Louis XVI reinstated the parlements, which retained their right to register royal edicts. However, the decree abolishing the guilds, among other decrees, generated immediate hostility from nobles, the Parlement of Paris, and from ordinary people, who rioted in Paris in 1775, because the freeing of the grain trade had brought higher prices in hard times. As complaints mounted about noble privileges, guild monopolies, and corrupt royal officials, the implications of Enlightenment thought led to political action. In 1774, Comptroller General of Finances N. Robert Turgot drew up a program to eliminate some monopolies and privileges that fettered the economy.
The financial crisis. The serious financial crisis that confronted the monarchy in the 1780s was the short-term cause of the French Revolution. France had been at war with Britain, as well as with other European powers, off and on for more than a century.
The financial support France had provided the rebel colonists in the American War of Independence against Britain had been underwritten by loans arranged by the King's Swiss Minister of Finance, Jacques Necker (1732–1804). Almost three-fourths of state expenses went to maintaining the army and navy, and to paying off debts accumulated from the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740–1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756–1763, as well as from the American War of Independence. The monarchy was living beyond its means.
The hesitant and naive Louis XVI was still in his 20s when he became king in 1774. Louis knew little of his kingdom, venturing beyond the region of Paris and Versailles only once during his reign. He preferred touring around the palace, taking clocks and watches apart and putting them back together. He excelled at hunting. The unpopularity of Louis's elegant, haughty wife, Marie Antoinette, 1755–1793, accentuated the public's lack of confidence in the throne, whether or not she really snarled "let them eat cake" when told that the people had no bread.
Who was Marie Antoinette? She was the daughter of the Austrian Queen Maria Theresa. She married to Louis to strengthen dynastic ties between Austria and France. She never felt really at home in France. Unhappy in her marriage, Marie Antoinette lived extravagantly and was embroiled in controversy. In 1785, she became entangled in a seamy scandal when a cardinal offered her a fabulous diamond necklace in the hope of winning favor. The necklace and some of the prelate's money were then deftly stolen by plotters, a strange scenario that included a prostitute posing as the queen. The diamond necklace affair, as it was called, seemed to augment the public image of the king as a weak man, a cuckold. The queen's reputed indiscretions and infidelities seemed to undercut the authority of the monarchy itself. Her detractors indelicately dubbed her the Austrian whore.
The old regime of France in 1700. 18th century French society was divided into three orders, or estates, which were legally defined groupings. The clergy constituted the first estate, the nobility the second estate, and everyone else, about 96% of the population, the third estate. The clergy and nobility, totaling about 500,000 out of a population of 26 million, enjoyed special privileges, receiving pensions and profitable positions from the king. The social structure of the old regime, based on privileges and inequalities sanctioned by law, produced tensions that contributed to the revolution.
The First Estate. The clergy reflected the social divisions in France. The upper clergy shared the attitudes and way of life of the nobility from which they sprang. The parish priests, commoners by birth, resented the haughtiness and luxurious living of the upper clergy. In 1789, when the revolution began, many priests sympathized with the reform-minded people of the Third Estate.
The Second Estate. Like the clergy, the nobility was a privileged order. Nobles held the highest positions in the church, army, and government. They were exempt from most taxes, or used their influence to evade taxes, collected manorial dues from peasants, and owned between 1/4 and 1/3 of the land. In addition to the income they drew from their estates, nobles were becoming increasingly involved in such non-aristocratic enterprises as banking, finance, commerce, and industry. Whether rich or poor, at court or in the country, the noble enjoyed special privileges. He was thought of as finer and better than common men. He was addressed in terms of respect, "My Lord and my Grace." For him the best places were reserved in the church or in the theater. Ordinary people drew aside to let him pass and bowed or doffed their hats. By birth, he was allowed to seek preference in the army, in the church or in the court. Both first and second estates were exempted from taxation.
The third estate, the common people, was by far the largest group in France. Everyone who was not a member of the first or second estates was a member of the third. It included wealthy merchants, whose wealth rivaled that of the nobility, doctors and lawyers, shopkeepers, the urban poor, the peasants who worked the land. About 98% of the people of France belonged to the third estate. The third estate paid taxes on everything from land to salt. Peasants had the least privileges. They paid rent on the land they farmed. They paid rent on the tools they used. They paid taxes on their crops. They could not even hunt animals who ate their crops. Only nobles could hunt. The structure of France. Political and social inequalities. The nobles and clergy enjoyed special privileges, such as land ownership and not paying taxes. The common people did not have power and freedom in politics. They worked hard and had to pay heavy taxes. Financial disorders also contributed to the weakness of the old regime. In the regime's last years, the government could not raise sufficient funds to cover expenses. Servicing the debt incurred during the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740-1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, placed an immense burden on the treasury. This burden reached crisis proportions when France incurred additional expenses by aiding the colonists in the American Revolution. Finances were in a shambles, not because France was impoverished, but because it had an inefficient and unjust tax system.
Although serious, the financial crisis could have been solved if the clergy, nobility, and bourgeoisie paid their fair share of taxes. Some progressive ministers recognized the need for comprehensive reforms, but nobles and clergy resisted them, clinging tenaciously to their ancient privileges.
In this cartoon from the time, Louis is looking at the chests and asks,
"Where is the tax money?"
The financial minister, Necker, looks on and says,
"The money was there last time I looked."
"The nobles and clergy are sneaking out the door carrying sacks of money, saying,
'We have it.'"
The expenditures France made on the American Revolution along with the huge sums the king spent to maintain his lavish lifestyle worsened its already precarious financial situation, and by the late 1780s the government lay close to bankruptcy. King Louis XVI's finance minister, Swiss banker Jacques Necker, knew that the poor had already been taxed as much as possible, and therefore a new source of revenue had to be found.
Necker urged the king to call a meeting of the Estates General in order to get the property tax implemented.
The king attempted to solve the financial crisis by removing some of the nobles' tax exemptions. However, the nobility saw themselves as special, with better blood, and entitled to all of their class privileges. The Parlement, a judicial organization controlled by the nobility, invoked its powers to block the king's move. He was forced reluctantly to call a meeting of the Estates General in 1789. This ancient feudal body had only met twice, once at its creation in 1302, and again in 1614, when the French Parliament insisted that any new taxes must be approved by this body. Each estate had one vote in the Estates General, despite the fact that the first and second estates only represented 3% of the population of France. In addition, since the first two estates always voted together, if the third estate disagreed with them, there was little it could do with its single vote. When the Estates General convened in Versailles in May 1789, the first and second estates had about 300 delegates each, while the third estate had about 600 delegates.
A controversy over voting arose almost immediately, as the Third Estate demanded that rather than having one vote per estate, each delegate be given a vote. This would have allowed the Third Estate the opportunity to gain a majority. The king, however, rejected this proposal.
When the Estates General met, each estate solemnly marched into the hall at Versailles. The third estate dressed all in black, the nobility dressed in all their finery, and the clergy dressed in full regalia. The delegates of the third estate insisted that the three orders meet together, and that the vote be taken by head, rather than by order.
Since there were far more delegates from the third estate, this plan would give them a majority. The king refused to grant their request. The third estate refused to budge.
After weeks of frustrating debate over voting, the representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly and claimed that they were France's true representative body. They invited members of the other estates to join them, and some members of the clergy and aristocracy did so.
The National Assembly was inspired by the influential Emmanuel Sieyès, who had earlier published a pamphlet that proclaimed the Third Estate and the nation were one.
Louis XVI ordered that the National Assembly be locked out of its meeting place. He continued to insist that the estates meet separately and that the National Assembly be disbanded. The National Assembly responded by moving to a nearby tennis court, where they vowed not to leave until France had a constitution.
This tennis court oath gained the assembly popularity among the working class and poor, and they even drew some of the more open-minded clergy and nobles to their side as well.
On June 27, the king reversed his position and ordered the first two estates to join the National Assembly. He also decided to call French troops into Paris to try to keep a lid on the volatile situation. They successfully challenged the nobility and defied the king. Institutional reforms such as drawing up a constitution to protect the people's rights and also limiting the king's power were put into place by the assembly. After recognizing that France was on the brink of a social revolution, many nobles reversed their support and sided with the king.
Louis XVI did not actually want a written constitution. When news of his plan to use military force against the National Assembly reached Paris on July 14, 1789, people stormed the Bastille. Later in the day, the prisoners were released. There were only 7. 2 were convicted forgers. 1 was a loose living aristocrat put in prison by his own father. Nevertheless, it was a great symbolic event, one which is still celebrated in France every year. The storming of the Bastille became on July 14, 1789, the official date of French independence with their motto,
Egalite, Liberte and Fraternite.
Bastille represented the absolute monarchy of France, in which the Parisians succeeded in taking it down. In Crane-Brinton's framework, the course that revolution seemed to take were impossible demands made of government which, if granted, would mean its end. Unsuccessful government attempts to suppress revolutionaries. Revolutionaries gain power and seem united. Once in power, revolutionaries begin to quarrel among themselves, and unity begins to dissolve. The moderates gain the leadership but fail to satisfy those who insist on further changes. Power is gained by progressively more radical groups until finally a lunatic fringe gains almost complete control. A strong man emerges and assumes great power. The extremists try to create a heaven on earth by introducing their whole program and by punishing all of their opponents. A period of terror, extreme violence occurs. Moderate groups regain power. The revolution is over. Rumors that the feudal aristocracy, the aristos, were sending hired brigands to attack peasants and pillage their land. The National Assembly responded to the great fear. On the night of August 4, 1789, one by one members of the nobility and clergy rose to give up feudal dues, serfdom, the tithe, hunting and fishing rights, personal privileges. In one night, feudalism was destroyed in France. But feudal dues were not renounced outright. This had been too strong a threat to the principle of private property. Peasants would compensate their landlords through a series of direct payments for obligations from which they had supposedly been freed. Therefore, the National Assembly made revolutionary gestures, but remained essentially moderate. Men are born free and equal in their rights. These rights are liberty, property, security and resistance to oppression. The fundamental source of all sovereignty resides in the nation. Rights to liberty, property, security and resistance to oppression. Every man presumed innocent until judged guilty. The law is the expression of the general will. All citizens have the right to take part personally, or through representatives, in the making of the law. The king was thought to be surrounded by evil advisors at Versailles, so he was forced to move to Paris and reside at the Tuileries Palace. The 4 phases of the French Revolution. One of the problems France was facing was on how to finance the new government. The National Assembly resolved the immediate financial crisis by seizing church lands, putting the church under the control of the state with a civil constitution of the clergy. Emmanuel Sieyès fiercely resisted the passage of this legislation and accused the other delegates of bourgeois envy.
But he was overruled.
The French Constitution of 1791. A bourgeois government. The king got the suspensive veto which prevented the passage of laws for 4 years. He could not pass laws. His ministers were responsible for their own actions. A permanent, elected, single chamber, National Assembly, had the power to grant taxation. An independent judiciary. The news of the king's flight destroyed the last of the king's popularity with the people of Paris. The popular press portrayed the royal family as pigs and public opinion plummeted. Increasingly there were demands for an end to the monarchy and the creation of a new kind of government, a republic. The foreign intervention. Neighboring nations like Austria and Prussia feared that revolution might spread in their territories. Thus they established an alliance against France.
Spreading the gospel of revolution. The French Revolution took on the character of a religious crusade. It was not enough to have a revolution at home. The gospel of revolution must be spread to the rest of Europe. France declared war on Prussia and Austria and proclaimed that it advanced the cause of liberty.
The National Convention was the new legislative body that replaced the National Assembly. The first act of this new government was to officially remove the king from the French government. France was declared a republic. The National Convention also discarded the traditional Gregorian calendar in favor of a revolutionary calendar. The year 1792 was labeled as Year 1.
2 main factions dominated the National Convention. Jacobin clubs were radical political groups that had sprung up throughout France during the Revolution. Initially, the Jacobins had total control of the National Convention. A split soon developed, however, between the Jacobins and the Girondins, who represented the provinces.
The Girondins were soon expelled from the Jacobins because they were too moderate. The most radical Jacobins were called the Mountain because they sat in the highest seats of the hall where the National Convention met. All 3 groups agreed that Louis had committed treason, but only the Mountain demanded his execution.
One of the most prominent Jacobin leaders was Jean-Paul Marat, who had been an early advocate of abolishing the monarchy. He advocated the elimination of any of the enemies of the revolution, and thus supported the September 1792 massacres, in which 1,200 political prisoners in the jails of Paris were killed by Jacobin-supported mobs. One of the most radical members of the National Convention, Marat strongly condemned the Girondins for being too moderate. The Girondins in turn saw him as an increasingly dangerous demagogue. On July 13, 1793, Marat was stabbed to death in his bathtub by Charlotte Corday, a young Girondin.
Another important Jacobin leader was Georges Danton, a member of the Commune of Paris who had helped organize the attack on the Tuileries and the overthrow of the monarchy. In the new republic, he became Minister of Justice. A member of the National Convention, he dominated the First Committee of Public Safety.
Danton probably meant boldness in fighting the war against Austria. But many took his words to refer to enemies within France. The radical press took up the cry,
"Let the blood of the traitors flow." and within hours of Danton's speech the streets of France did indeed run with blood. By September 7, over 1,000 were dead.
It was a country lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre who would come to symbolize much of the fanaticism of the French Revolution. First as a member of the National Convention and then as the head of the infamous Committee of Public Safety, he sought to have all of the ideals of the revolution enforced and, in doing so, perverted the ideals so many had struggled to attain. In his own words, "To establish and consolidate democracy, to achieve the peaceful rule of constitutional laws we must finish the war of liberty against tyranny.
We must annihilate the enemies of the Republic at home and abroad or else we perish," said Robespierre.
The trial of the king was hastened by the discovery in a secret cupboard in the Tuileries of a cache of documents. They proved conclusively Louis's knowledge and encouragement of foreign intervention. The National Convention voted 387 to 334 to execute the monarchs. The final Girondin blow was struck, however, when Charlotte Corday, a Girondin sympathizer, gained entrance to Marat's bath and stabbed him. Marat immediately became a martyr to the revolution. He was given a hero's funeral, and the procession lasted 7 hours. The Revolutionary Tribunal of Paris alone executed 2,639 victims in 15 months. The total number of victims nationwide was over 20,000. Robespierre was the mastermind of the Reign of Terror. He was the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, the Executive Committee of the National Convention, and the most powerful man in France. He explained how terror would lead to the Republic of Virtue in a speech to the National Convention.
If the spring of popular government in time of peace is virtue, the springs of popular government in revolution are at once virtue and terror, virtue, without which terror is fatal, terror, without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible.
The end justifies the means. Describes Robespierre's policy well.
It was premised upon Enlightenment principles of rationality. The metric system of weights and measures was defined by the French Academy of Sciences in 1791 and enforced in 1793. It replaced weights and measures that had their origins in the Middle Ages. The abolition of slavery within France in 1791 and throughout the French colonies in 1794. The convention legalized divorce and enacted shared inheritance laws even for illegitimate offspring, in an attempt to eradicate inequalities. Devised a plan for national education. Began the task of compiling national laws. Protected women's property rights. Authorized a religion of reason. All persons be addressed as citizens. By 1799, all sides wanted a strong, dynamic ruler who must be educated in reason.
The time is right for Napoleon Bonaparte.
The time is right for Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1789, the French had created a republic, under the name of a monarchy. 10 years later, they created a monarchy, under the name of a republic. Loss of privilege and political influence of the aristocracy. First is the rise of the bourgeoisie, the middle class. Access to top state offices. France answers middle class needs, reflects their values. Second is the birth of the modern state, no longer the private property of the king's citizens, not subjects. Specific rights and duties. Third is the practical application of the ideas of the philosophes: equality before the law, trial by jury, the freedom of religion, speech in the press. Liberties implied certain political ideals. Government should be exercised, not autocratically by divine right, but constitutionally by the sovereign will of the governed. The individual should not be subject to the arbitrary rule of a king, but should be guaranteed possession of personal liberties which no state might abridge. Such were liberties of conscience, worship, speech, and publication. The liberty of owning private property was proclaimed by the French Revolution to be an inherent right of man. Égalité signified the social principles of the revolution. It meant the abolition of privilege, the end of serfdom, the destruction of the feudal system. It assumed that all men were equal before the law. It carried the hope that every man might have an equal chance with every other man in the pursuit of life and happiness. Fraternite was the symbol of the idealistic brotherhood of those who sought to make the world better, happier, and more just. At the same time, it was the watchword of the new French nationalism. For the sake of humanity, the French nation should be exalted.